Hello, it's Matthew here from the Nations of Sanity project. I'm just doing a quick video for the Together Strong project, which is a project based on bringing people together for common cause. More specifically, this channel is based on bringing libertarian thinkers together to discuss and debate various elements so that we can refine our understanding and get closer to truth. Now, the first debate in this series was a debate between Stephan Kinsella and Walter Block on the subject of voluntary slavery. Basically, the question being debated was, can voluntary slavery be a legitimate thing in a libertarian society? Can people enter into voluntary slavery contracts, and are those contracts enforceable? Stephan Kinsella says no, Walter Block says yes, and I'll put a link in the description to their debate. I recommend people check that out because they both presented their arguments, and they both presented their counter arguments to each other's arguments, and I thought it was a very interesting debate, not just to kind of put to explore this specific issue, but also for all the other elements that it illuminates. Like, it explored what self-ownership really means, it explored what a contract really is, and I think these are things that came out in the debate, as well as obviously exploring and scrutinizing this specific question. Now, just to declare, before the debate, I was in agreement with Stephan that a voluntary slavery contract would not be enforceable. And after the debate, I still agree with Stephan that a voluntary slavery contract is not enforceable. But I think it was very important. The arguments that Walter raised were very good arguments and were points that needed to be addressed. But I do think that Stephan did address those arguments in his counter arguments. One of the kind of primary elements of Walter's argument was basically to make the point, which was a valid point, that if people have individual self-ownership, then who are we to prevent them from entering into voluntary slavery contracts? That they have the right to sell themselves. Much like we have the right to sell ourselves into an employment contract. A voluntary slavery contract might be a little bit more extreme, but it would be the same principle. But from Stephan's point of view, and this is certainly something I agree with, he wasn't saying that we're preventing people from entering into these contracts. He accepted that people do have the right to, quote unquote, sell themselves into like an employment contract or a voluntary slavery contract, but they also have the right to withdraw that consent. And the problem with a voluntary slavery contract is, while people have the right to, sign into such a contract, they don't really have the ability to truly sell themselves, like in the way that you might sell a car, and you can actually give it's property that you can actually transfer ownership over, and you can give the keys over and give full autonomy over to somebody else. That's no longer your possession. From a property rights point, that's no longer your property, from a property rights point of view, and it's no longer in your possession. You no longer have any autonomous control over it. The problem is you can't really do that with yourself. You can't truly sell yourself. You're not property. And while you can make a promise to act as if your autonomy is no longer your own, you can promise to act as somebody's slave, in all the ways that might entail, but you can't truly give yourself over. You can't truly give your autonomy to somebody else. It will always be yours. And while you are free in a libertarian society to enter into any kind of contract you like, a voluntary slavery contract would not be one that would really be enforceable, because while you have the right to enter into it, you would also have the right to withdraw that consent. And if someone forced you to be the slave that you promised to be after you've withdrawn your consent, then they're enslaving you in a way that violates the non-aggression principle. So that's where I really think that was the winning argument, in my opinion, from Stephan. Because, as I say, Walter made a very good point about the fact that, a free individual with self-ownership has the right to enter into contracts and to, quote unquote, sell themselves. But just like we sell ourselves into an employment contract, we're not truly selling ourselves like we would sell a car, where we can give property over to somebody else. Our ownership is kind of inalienable, and not something we can truly give away. And while we can certainly consent to certain contracts where we make these promises to act in a certain way, we can also withdraw that consent. And while there may be penalties to pay for violating a contract, certain monetary penalties or property transfers and things like that can be enforced, actually enforcing the slavery itself is not viable. And one of the points that I thought really helped hammer this home was sort of towards the end of the debate, I asked Walter to kind of transpose this argument from voluntary slavery contract to like a sex contract. So I asked him, like, say you had a sex contract with a prostitute, and they agreed to, have sex with you, say for a certain amount of money or whatever the terms were. But then before it came to them to fulfill their end of the contract by having sex with you, let's say they changed their mind and they withdrew their consent. Now, they might be guilty of violating a contract and there may be penalties to pay, but if you force them to have sex, that would be raping them. The fact that they previously agreed doesn't change the fact that they withdrew that consent. And after they've withdrawn that consent, if you were forced to have someone to have sex, then that would be rape. And by the same kind of logic and rationale, if you force someone to be your quote unquote slave when they have actually explicitly withdrawn that consent to such an agreement, then that would be enslaving them. Another point that's probably worth making is voluntary slavery in a way is obviously a bit of an oxymoron, because obviously if it's voluntary, it's not truly slavery. But when we were talking about voluntary slavery contract, we're obviously talking about a contract where it's basically an employment contract where you're agreeing that you can't opt out. But the fact of the matter is you can't make that promise because you can opt out. You can't truly surrender your self-ownership. And I think that is the crux of Stephan's argument, at least from how I understood it. And that's certainly my own kind of opinion on the matter. And I do think that the example of the sex contract helps hammer home how enforcing such contracts would involve a clear NAP violation. Because if you enforced a sex contract after the prostitute changed her mind, then you would be raping her. And if you enforced a quote unquote slavery contract after the person changed their mind, then you would be enslaving them. And rape and slavery are both clear violations of the non-aggression principle. They're clear violations of individual self-ownership. So it's not a case of saying people can't enter into these contracts. It's just a case of saying these contracts are kind of nonsense because you're promising something you can't really give. And the best you could do is to promise to act in a certain way. But, contracts can be broken. And while there may be penalties to pay, enslaving somebody or raping somebody certainly would not be a proportionate penalty to pay for violating a contract. So that's kind of where I feel that's where I feel the truth lies. But obviously, I'm not any kind of oracle of truth, so that's just my opinion. Anyone else who's watched this debate, I'd like to hear your opinion on it. If you agree with Walter, please give your reasons why. If you agree with Stephan, please give your reasons why. If you think there's other arguments that have not been considered, please give your reasons why. And just to kind of wrap this up, another reason why I thought this debate was very interesting. Some people might think that voluntary slavery is a little bit of a fringe issue. And even in a free society, maybe our top concern isn't people who have entered into quote unquote slavery contracts and whether or not that can be enforced. But I think what this debate also helped illuminate is help sort of clarify our understanding of what self-ownership truly means and what a contract is. And, a contract really is just a promise. Now, a contract can also be a confirmation of property transfer and things like that. So if I sign a contract to say you own my car now, you own my car. But that's very simple because I can fully give you ownership of my property. And the contract is really just proof of that transaction. And just like a voluntary slavery contract would be proof that I've made this promise. That's all it is. It's a promise. It's proof that I've made a promise. I haven't actually given you myself in a true way because I can't. I will always be me. I will always have autonomy. And while I can certainly promise to act as if I am yours and I have no autonomy and I am your slave and all the rest of it, the fact of the matter is if I withdraw that consent and then you force me to be your slave anyway, then you would be in violation of the non-aggression principle. But as I say, that's just my opinion. I'll be very keen to get other people's opinions. I just want to repeat my appreciation to Stephan Kinsella and Walter Block for having this good faith debate and bringing excellent arguments from both sides. And I hope that we'll continue this journey of exploring these different elements and getting closer to truth through good faith discussion and debate. And thank you everyone who's watching this.